I have always liked stories that refuse to behave themselves, the kind that sit politely in police files for a few decades, then quietly slide back into conversation as if to say, I am still here, you know. The Isdal Woman is one of those stories. It does not shout. It does not beg for attention. It simply waits, confident that curiosity will eventually wander back into its path. It begins in Norway, which already feels like an unfair advantage for a mystery. Mountains that look like they were designed by someone who enjoys drama. Forests that can swallow sound. Weather that changes its mind every half hour. It is the sort of place where secrets do not feel out of place. They feel like part of the landscape. On a cold Sunday in late November of 1970, a father and his two daughters decided to go for a walk in a valley just outside the city of Bergen. The place was called Isdal, which translates neatly and ominously into Ice Valley. Even on a good day, it was not the sort of place you would describe as welcoming. Steep slopes, narrow paths, rocks slick with moisture, a wind that seemed to enjoy pushing people slightly off balance. They were not looking for anything. That is usually how these things go. They were just walking, talking about nothing in particular, enjoying the sort of family outing that is forgotten almost as soon as it ends. Then one of the girls noticed something dark among the rocks. At first it looked like a pile of old clothes. Then it looked like something else entirely. The body of a woman lay sprawled on the stones. She had been burned, not by an accident, not by a campfire gone wrong. She had been burned deliberately, thoroughly, as if someone wanted to make very sure of something. Her face was charred, her hands were blackened, her clothes were reduced to scraps of fabric and melted plastic. Around her were items placed almost carefully: a bottle of liquor, 2 plastic water containers, a scarf, a pair of rubber boots, a spoon, what looked like a passport, burned beyond recognition. It did not take long for the police to arrive. Isdalen, quiet and indifferent, became suddenly busy with uniforms, radios, and the sound of boots on stone. They examined the scene. They photographed everything. They tried to reconstruct what might have happened here, in a valley that did not care about their theories. The first thing they noticed was that this did not look like a hiking accident. The woman was lying on her back. Her arms were bent at strange angles. Her legs were positioned as if she had either been placed there or had collapsed in a very particular way. Around her, 12 sleeping pills were scattered on the ground. Phenobarbital, a sedative, strong enough to make someone drowsy, strong enough to make someone unconscious if taken in sufficient quantity. Her hair was dark. Her features were sharp even through the damage. She looked, according to the officers who saw her, well dressed, well cared for. Not someone who belonged in a remote valley, wearing rubber boots and carrying plastic jugs of liquid. There were no identification documents on her body, no purse, no wallet, no keys. The burned remains of what might have been a passport suggested she had not simply forgotten her papers at home. It suggested something more intentional. The autopsy would complicate things further. The medical examiner found soot in her lungs, which meant she had been breathing while the fire burned. She had not been dead when the flames started. Her stomach contained a mixture of phenobarbital and alcohol, enough to sedate her, enough to make her slow, but not necessarily enough to kill her outright. Her blood showed traces of carbon monoxide. She had inhaled smoke. She had been alive as the fire took hold. There were bruises on her neck, not dramatic, not theatrical, the sort of bruises that might come from pressure, fingers perhaps, or a hand. And then there was the small detail that always seems to matter later. Her fingerprints had been partially removed, not completely, just enough to suggest someone had tried. At this point, the story could have gone in a dozen directions. A tragic suicide, a lonely traveller who wandered into the valley to die in a theatrical way, a crime of passion, a robbery gone wrong, a random act of violence. But the woman, it turned out, had been very busy in the weeks before her death. When the police circulated her description to hotels in Bergen, something interesting happened. Several receptionists called back, not to say they had no idea who she was, but to say they remembered her very clearly. She had stayed in multiple hotels across the city and surrounding areas. She always paid in cash. She always checked in under a different name, and she always filled out her registration cards with meticulous, elegant handwriting. At one hotel, she had been called Elizabeth Lienhauer, supposedly from Belgium. At another, she had been Claudia Tielt, also from Belgium. Elsewhere, she used the name Finella Lork. Sometimes she claimed to be Dutch, sometimes German, sometimes from Switzerland. Her accents were just as flexible as her names. One clerk swore she sounded French. Another thought she was German. Someone else was convinced she spoke Norwegian with a foreign twist. She seemed to be whatever the situation required her to be. She was always well dressed, tailored coats, stylish boots, expensive-looking scarves. She carried herself with the sort of confidence that makes people assume you belong wherever you happen to be standing. And then there were her habits. She asked for rooms with balconies, always balconies. She moved frequently, rarely staying in one place more than a day or two. She wrote in notebooks. She received phone calls. She made phone calls. Sometimes she seemed relaxed and charming. Sometimes she seemed tense, distracted, as if she were waiting for something she did not entirely trust. In one hotel, a maid later reported something odd. The woman had pushed a wardrobe in front of her door, as if she were trying to block it. Not completely, just enough to make noise if someone tried to enter. The police began to collect her hotel registration cards. They laid them out side by side, different names, different birth dates, different addresses, but the same handwriting, the same neat, careful loops of ink. They found her luggage at the Bergen train station, left behind in a locker. 2 suitcases. Inside, the story deepened. There were clothes, stylish, expensive, but all the labels had been cut out, every single one, as if she did not want anyone to know where they had come from. There were wigs, several of them, different colours, different styles. There were glasses with non-prescription lenses, a makeup kit, a small notebook filled with strange codes, rows of letters and numbers that did not immediately make sense. But there was money, cash in several currencies, Norwegian kroner, German marks, British pounds, Swiss francs. There were spoons, multiple spoons, which is one of those details that seems meaningless until you cannot stop thinking about it. There were maps, marked with small red dots, places along the Norwegian coast, Bergen, Stavanger, Trondheim, remote areas, popular tourist spots, and places that did not look like tourist destinations at all. If this were a novel, this would be the point where someone would say the word spy out loud. In real life, the police were more careful. They said she was mysterious. They said she was living under false identities. They said her movements were unusual. But they also quietly began to wonder who exactly they were dealing with. They tried to trace her phone calls. Some led to public payphones. Some led to hotels where she had already checked out. One call, made shortly before her death, was traced to a man in Bergen. He said he had never heard of her, that he had no idea why she would have called him. There were witnesses too. A couple hiking in Isdal around the time of her death reported seeing a woman who matched her description. She was not alone. 2 men were walking behind her. They did not seem friendly. They did not seem relaxed. They seemed, in the couple's words, like they were following her. Another witness saw a woman in the area who looked distressed, glancing over her shoulder as she walked. The police tried to reconstruct her final hours. She checked out of her last hotel in Bergen on November 23rd. She told the receptionist she was going to catch a train. Instead, she took a taxi to a road near Isdal. The driver remembered her. She paid in cash. She seemed calm. From there, she walked into the valley. She was wearing her rubber boots. She carried the plastic jugs. One of them contained gasoline, which is another one of those details that refuses to sit quietly. Gasoline does not accidentally find its way into your hands. It is not something you pick up on impulse. It suggests planning or someone else's involvement. The official conclusion, eventually, would be suicide. The idea was that she had taken the sleeping pills, poured gasoline over herself, and set herself on fire. It is a conclusion that technically fits the evidence if you squint at it long enough. But it leaves a great many things politely unexplained. Why the false identities? Why the coded notebook? Why the wigs and the glasses? Why the removed clothing labels? Why the bruises on her neck? Why the witnesses who saw her with 2 men? Why the partially erased fingerprints? Why the effort to destroy her passport? And perhaps most interestingly, why someone who went to such lengths to control how she was seen in life would choose such a chaotic, public way to disappear. Years passed, the case went cold in the way cold cases do, not with a dramatic closing of a file, but with a gradual quieting of interest. The world found new mysteries, new headlines, new distractions, but the Isdal Woman did not go away. In the late 1990s, a professor at the University of Bergen decided to take another look at the evidence. He brought in students. They examined the notebooks. They analysed the codes. They tried to make sense of her movements. The code, it turned out, was not particularly sophisticated. Each letter corresponded to a place. B for Bergen, S for Stavanger, T for Trondheim. The numbers indicated dates. It was a travel log, a record of where she had been and when, which made her even more interesting. She had been systematic, organised, careful. In the 2000s, the case found a new audience: journalists, podcasters, amateur detectives with time and an internet connection, and then, finally, something that felt almost modern: DNA. In 2016, Norwegian authorities exhumed her body. They extracted DNA from her teeth. They sent it to labs across Europe. They hoped to find a match, a relative, a name. What they found was not a name, but a suggestion. Her genetic profile suggested she had roots in Central Europe, possibly Germany, possibly Austria. Her teeth told another story. The isotopes in her enamel suggested she had grown up in a place with a very particular type of water and soil, somewhere near the border between Germany and France, or perhaps in Eastern Europe. It was not a solution, but it was a narrowing of the field. And then there was the photograph. Among her belongings was a small, blurred image of a woman standing on a set of stairs. She is turned slightly away from the camera. Her face is not clear, but there is something about the way she stands, a confidence, a posture that suggests she is aware of being watched and does not entirely mind. That photograph has become, in a way, her ghost, shared online, enhanced, cropped, studied. People have tried to match her face to missing persons reports, to old passports, to school photographs, to family albums. So far, she remains what she has always been, a woman with no name, or perhaps too many names. And that is where this story becomes personal for me. Not in the sense that I knew her, obviously not, but in the way she invites a certain kind of attention, the kind that does not want to solve her so much as understand her. Because there is a difference. Solving her would mean finding a name, a birthplace, a family, closing the loop, writing a final sentence that says, "This is who she was." Understanding her means accepting that she may have been exactly who she wanted to be, a person who moved through the world lightly, carefully, leaving as little trace as possible, someone who knew how to disappear long before she actually did. And that raises an uncomfortable question, one I find myself returning to more often than I probably should. If someone goes to such extraordinary lengths to erase themselves, what are we really doing when we try so hard to bring them back? There is a temptation, once you learn about the coded notebooks and the rotating identities, to leap straight into the world of espionage. It feels neat, it feels cinematic, it gives shape to a story that otherwise refuses to hold still. And to be fair, Norway in the early 1970s was not exactly a quiet corner of the world. This was the Cold War, even if most people preferred to pretend it was happening somewhere else. The Soviet Union sat just beyond Norway's northern border. NATO bases dotted the coastline. Radar stations, naval facilities, missile testing sites. The kind of places that do not advertise themselves with cheerful signs but do show up, eventually, on certain kinds of maps. And the Isdal Woman had maps. Her red dots did not just mark Bergen and the postcard-friendly towns. They clustered around places that, in retrospect, look interesting for reasons that have nothing to do with scenery. Near naval bases, near areas used for weapons testing, near stretches of coastline where submarines were known to pass through cold, dark water. One of her noted destinations was a small town called Stavanger. On the surface, it was a perfectly ordinary place. Oil industry, fishing, ferries. But just outside the city was a NATO listening post, a facility that paid very close attention to what moved through the North Sea. Another dot appeared near Trondheim, not far from a major military installation. Yet another, near an area where Norway tested its Penguin anti-ship missiles. You can, of course, connect these dots in a way that makes her look like a roaming intelligence asset, drifting from place to place, collecting impressions, noting movements, listening for things that were not meant to be heard. You can also connect them in a way that makes her look like a tourist with a slightly unusual taste in destinations. This is the problem with this case. Almost every detail has two equally convincing explanations, and they cancel each other out so neatly that you are left standing in the middle, holding both. The police, back in 1970, did consider espionage. They consulted with intelligence services. They asked quiet questions. They never, officially, said very much about what answers they received. Unofficially, rumours began to circulate. One theory suggested she was an East German spy. Another claimed she worked for the French. Someone else insisted she was Israeli, or Russian, or Belgian, or something more complicated than any of those. The wigs, the accents, the cash in multiple currencies, the hotel hopping, the coded notes. It all fits, if you want it to. But there are details that feel oddly human for a professional intelligence operative. The spoons, for instance. Why carry so many spoons? The makeup, the careful clothing, the way she chatted with hotel staff, the way she seemed, at times, lonely. A spy, at least in fiction, is usually efficient to the point of coldness. This woman left traces of personality behind her, little ripples in the water. There is a hotel clerk in Bergen who remembered her particularly well. He said she had a laugh that did not quite match her serious expression, that she sometimes seemed amused by things that other people missed, that she ordered meals she barely touched, as if the act of sitting in a restaurant mattered more to her than the food itself. In Stavanger, a waiter remembered her sitting alone, staring out a window for nearly an hour, her coffee going cold in front of her. These are not the behaviours of someone in a hurry, which brings us back to the idea that perhaps she was not running toward something, but away from it. There is another, quieter theory. One that does not involve governments or secret services or coded messages hidden in plain sight. The idea that she was simply a woman who did not want to be found. People disappear all the time for reasons that are both dramatic and painfully ordinary. Escaping an abusive relationship, avoiding a family they cannot face, leaving behind a life that feels like it has closed in around them. The Isdal woman had money, she had style, she had the ability to move through different countries without attracting much attention. This suggests she had resources, connections, or at least a past that was not entirely desperate. But something had driven her to reinvent herself again and again. New name, new accent, new backstory. It is almost like watching someone try on lives, one hotel room at a time. One of the more unsettling details, when you think about it long enough, is how good she was at it. Hotel staff believed her stories. Taxi drivers remembered her as polite, unremarkable. People passed her in the street and saw nothing worth remembering. She was invisible in the most ordinary way possible, until she was not. There is a small, strange detail in the police files that does not get as much attention as it deserves. The woman's stomach contents included not just sleeping pills and alcohol, but traces of soot, which means she inhaled smoke, which means she was breathing as the fire burned. This is often used to argue that she took her own life, that she set the fire herself. But consider for a moment what that would actually require: to pour gasoline over your own body, to strike a match, to stand there as the flames climb, to not run, to not try to put it out, to not, at the very last moment, choose survival over whatever you believe you are escaping. It is not impossible. People have done it. But it is not easy. It is not quick. It is not quiet. And yet, there were no reports of screams echoing through the valley. No hikers heard anything unusual. No one came running. The valley, apparently, kept its silence. Then, there are the bruises on her neck. They were never explained in a way that satisfied everyone. The official line suggested they could have been caused by her falling or by the position of her body, which is plausible. It is also convenient. The partially removed fingerprints are another problem. If this was a suicide, who tried to erase her prints? And why only partially? There is a theory that someone else was there, that someone assisted her, or forced her, or simply cleaned up afterward. Witnesses who saw her with two men in the area have never been identified. The men were never found. The descriptions were vague: middle-aged, dark clothing, foreign accents, which, in Norway, could mean almost anything. One of the more chilling possibilities is that she was being watched, followed, not by a single person, but by a system. The kind that does not wear trench coats or dark glasses, but simply notices patterns, travel routes, phone calls, hotel stays. If she was involved in something sensitive, something that brushed up against the edges of national security, her disappearance might have been less of a mystery and more of a solution. That is the sort of thought that makes people uncomfortable, and understandably so. It suggests a world where answers exist, but are not meant to be shared. Then again, it also makes the Isdal woman feel larger than she might have been. It turns her into a character in a geopolitical drama, when she might have simply been a person who made a series of choices that led her to a very lonely place. One of the things that strikes me every time I revisit this story is how little physical evidence there really is. No known family, no confirmed friends, no photographs of her smiling at a birthday party or standing beside someone who looks like they belong with her. Just hotel rooms, suitcases, notes, a blurred photograph, and a body in a valley. In 2020, a podcast series dedicated an entire season to her. They tracked down witnesses, they examined police files, they even found a woman in France who believed the Isdal woman might have been her long-lost sister. The story went like this. Her sister had disappeared decades earlier. She had cut off contact with the family. She had travelled. She had reinvented herself. When the French woman saw the sketches of the Isdal woman, she felt a shock of recognition. DNA tests were done. They did not match. Which is, in a way, the most perfect ending this story could have for that particular chapter. Another door that opens just wide enough to let hope through, then closes again. The Norwegian authorities still keep the case technically open, not in the sense that detectives are actively knocking on doors, but in the sense that if a name ever does surface, they are willing to listen, and names do surface from time to time. Amateur sleuths suggest possibilities. Old missing persons reports are dragged into the light and compared. Faces are overlaid. Timelines are aligned. So far, none of them hold. Which leaves us with the Isdal woman. As a kind of mirror, people see in her what they are most drawn to. Spies see espionage. Romantics see a tragic runaway. Skeptics see a simple case of suicide wrapped in too much storytelling. I find myself somewhere in between, which is a comfortable place to be for a story like this. Because the most interesting part, for me, is not how she died. It is how she lived. Briefly, quietly, under names that were not hers, in rooms that she would never see again. There is a strange beauty in that, a life made of moments that do not connect in a way anyone else can follow. And perhaps that's the point. Perhaps the Isdal woman did not want to be solved. Perhaps she wanted to be remembered as a question. There is a moment in every investigation, formal or amateur, when you stop looking at the evidence and start looking at the person, not the body, not the belongings, the idea of them, the shape of their life as it might have been. This is where the Isdal woman becomes less of a case and more of a presence. People have tried to give her a name for decades. It is a deeply human impulse. A name feels like a kind of rescue, a way of pulling someone back from the edge of anonymity and saying, "You were here, you mattered." The problem is that almost every name that has been suggested comes with just enough evidence to be tempting, and just enough contradiction to fall apart if you press it too hard. One of the earliest serious theories pointed toward a woman named Genevieve Lancier, a Belgian woman who disappeared in the 1960s. She had a history of travel. She had connections in different countries. There were vague physical similarities. For a while it looked promising, but the timelines did not line up cleanly, and when photographs were compared more closely, the match faded. Another theory focused on a woman from Germany who had vanished after a complicated divorce. She was known to use different names. She spoke multiple languages. Her age would have been right. Again, the details refused to cooperate. Then there were the more exotic suggestions. A Hungarian refugee, a Czech national who fled after the Prague Spring, a woman from the Balkans who moved through Western Europe on forged documents. Each theory added another layer of story, another set of imagined childhoods, another family somewhere, perhaps still waiting for a door to open. What makes these theories so difficult to evaluate is how little we truly know about her early life. The isotope analysis of her teeth suggested she grew up in a region with very specific environmental markers, somewhere near the border of France and Germany, or possibly in Eastern Europe. That narrows the map, but not nearly enough. Her dental work offered another small clue. She had gold crowns. The style and materials suggested they were done in a country where that kind of work was common in the 1950s or 60s. Not Norway, not Britain, more likely somewhere in Central or Eastern Europe. This detail tends to get overshadowed by the spy theories, but I find it quietly fascinating. Teeth are personal in a way passports are not. They carry the imprint of decisions made years earlier, a dentist chosen, a procedure paid for, a moment in a chair somewhere under a bright light, with a mouth open and a life still very much in progress. Someone, somewhere, once knew her well enough to know what she looked like when she smiled. There is also the question of her age. The official estimate placed her in her early 30s, but estimates are just that. Guesses with confidence. She could have been younger, she could have been older. If she was older, the idea of a long life behind her becomes more compelling. A history of reinvention. A series of chapters that ended before we ever got to see them. Her handwriting is another small, human detail that refuses to stay small. It was neat, elegant, deliberate. The kind of handwriting that suggests practice, education. Someone who had been taught to write in a formal way, perhaps in a school that valued presentation as much as content. She did not rush her letters, she shaped them. This might seem trivial, but in a case where almost everything else is missing, the shape of a letter can feel like a fingerprint of the mind. One of the more persistent theories connects her to intelligence work, not because of where she went, but how she behaved. The multiple identities, the removal of clothing labels, the coded notes, the careful attention to being seen, but not too clearly. There is a term sometimes used in intelligence circles for people who operate without official cover. They live as civilians, they travel as tourists, they blend in not by standing out, but by being forgettable. The Isdal Woman, by most accounts, was exactly that. Polite, stylish, reserved. The sort of person you might remember in vague terms, but not in detail. But there is a flaw in this theory that keeps nagging at me. Professional intelligence operations, particularly during the Cold War, were expensive, carefully managed, structured. People were assets. They were not usually left to wander alone, changing names at will, paying cash, carrying notebooks full of codes that could be found in a train station locker. It feels, in some ways, too loose, too improvised, which brings us back to the idea that she may have been working for herself. There is a possibility that she was involved in something less glamorous and more dangerous. Smuggling, black market trading, the kind of work that thrives in the shadows between countries and currencies. Her travel routes, her cash, her avoidance of official documentation, all fit this model as well. The Cold War created not just spies, but entire underground economies. Goods, information, people, all moving quietly across borders. If she was part of that world, her death could have been a consequence of a deal gone wrong. A meeting that did not end the way it was supposed to. The two men seen in the valley start to look less like mysterious agents and more like business partners, or rivals, or something in between. There is also the question of the gasoline. Carrying it into a remote valley is a strange choice if you are planning to meet someone. It is an even stranger choice if you are planning to disappear quietly, unless the gasoline was not for her. Another detail that often gets overlooked is the spoon found at the scene. One of the theories suggests it may have been used to measure the sleeping pills, a way to control the dose. That implies deliberation, planning, a careful approach to whatever was about to happen. It could also imply that someone else was doing the measuring. In 2018, a team of researchers and journalists revisited the case with modern forensic tools. They created a new facial reconstruction. They aged her. They smoothed the lines. They gave her a more lifelike presence. The image spread online. People shared it, compared it, sent it to relatives, looked at it a little too long in quiet rooms. Nothing definitive came back, which is, again, strangely fitting. One of the things I find myself wondering is how she felt about the constant movement, the hotel rooms, the trains, the changing names. There is a kind of romance to that, from a distance, a life unbound by routine, but there is also a kind of exhaustion. Imagine never unpacking completely, never getting comfortable, always knowing you will be gone in a day or two, always being a version of yourself rather than the whole thing. There is a line in one of her notebooks that people like to point to, though it is not actually a line, just a cluster of symbols that someone once tried to interpret as a phrase. It probably is not, but the idea that she might have left behind a message, even an accidental one, is hard to let go of. The Isdal Woman exists now in a strange space between person and story. She has become a character in a collective narrative. Each retelling adds a little more shape, a little more meaning, and yet the core remains stubbornly empty. We do not know where she was born. We do not know what language she spoke when she was alone. We do not know who she trusted, if anyone. We do not know what she wanted. What we do know is that she went to a valley called Ice Valley, carrying gasoline and sleeping pills. And something happened there that ended her life. Whether that something was a decision she made or a decision made for her is the question that keeps this story alive. Because if it was her choice, then the Isdal Woman becomes a story about control, about someone who decided how her story would end, even if she could not control how it would be told. If it was not her choice, then it becomes a story about power, about someone who took that control away, and neither of those possibilities is particularly comforting. The internet did something to the Isdal Woman that the police never quite managed. It gave her a kind of second life. Not in the physical sense, obviously, but in the way stories circulate when they are no longer confined to filing cabinets and local newspapers. Suddenly, she was everywhere, on forums, in comment sections, in late-night threads where people with insomnia and curiosity compared notes across continents. A retired engineer in Canada might be looking at the same scanned police report as a student in Berlin. A woman in France might recognize a hairstyle from a photograph that someone in Norway just uploaded. This kind of investigation is messy. It is emotional. It is full of false leads and overconfident conclusions. But it is also relentless. It does not clock out at 5. It does not run out of funding. One of the most interesting developments to come out of this digital phase was the re-examination of witness statements that had been quietly filed away for decades. Take the taxi driver who took her from her last hotel to the road near Isdalen. For years, his account was treated as a simple detail. A woman, cash payment, calm demeanour. When people started to look at it more closely, they noticed something else. He remembered her specifically asking to be dropped off at a spot that did not make much sense as a hiking starting point. It was not a trailhead. It was not marked. It was just a stretch of road. That suggests she knew exactly where she was going, or at least thought she did. Then there is the witness who saw her in a shop shortly before her death. She bought postcards, which is a small, almost tender detail. The kind of thing you do when you plan to write to someone, or when you like the idea of doing so, even if you never follow through. None of those postcards were found among her belongings, which raises the question of whether she sent them. There is also the matter of the hotel staff who remembered her receiving phone calls. Not just one, several. The content of those calls was never recorded, obviously, but the pattern itself is interesting. Someone was reaching her, or she was arranging to be reached. In one case, a receptionist recalled her becoming visibly tense after a call. Not angry, not frightened, just alert, as if a quiet countdown had started. This is the kind of detail that means nothing on its own, but when you line it up next to everything else, it starts to look like a signal. The digital investigators began to build timelines that were far more granular than anything the police had done in the 1970s. They mapped her movements down to the hour. They matched train schedules, ferry times, hotel check-in and check-out windows. What they found was that she often seemed to move just ahead of something, a military exercise, a naval deployment, a public event. Again, this could be coincidence. Norway is not a large country. The number of major events is limited, but the pattern is suggestive enough to keep people interested. There is also the small matter of her language skills. Witnesses reported that she spoke several languages fluently, not just enough to get by, enough to pass, enough to sound like she belonged. That level of fluency usually comes from either formal training or long exposure, or both. One theory suggests she may have worked as a translator or interpreter, a job that would naturally put her in contact with people from different countries, a job that might also explain her comfort with shifting identities. If that were the case, her travels could have been professional rather than clandestine. Conferences, meetings, private clients, the sort of work that leaves little in the way of public records. But again, we run into the problem of the gasoline and the valley. Another modern angle has focused on her money. The mix of currencies suggests recent travel through several countries. It also suggests she avoided banks, avoided leaving a financial trail. Some online investigators have tried to trace serial numbers on the banknotes found in her suitcase, using old records and collectors. It is an ambitious idea. So far, it has not gone very far. Then there is the question of her clothing. Even without labels, fashion experts have tried to date her outfits. The cut of her coats, the style of her boots, the patterns on her scarves. They place her firmly in the late 1960s, early 1970s, trend aware, not cutting edge, but certainly not behind. This suggests she was paying attention. She cared about how she was seen. One of the more unsettling developments in recent years has been the use of facial recognition software. People have fed her reconstructed face into databases, hoping for a match with old passports, immigration records, school photographs. The results are always tantalizing and never definitive. A woman in Poland, a woman in Austria, a woman in France. Each one looks just enough like her to make you lean closer to the screen, and then you lean back. There was a moment, not long ago, when a woman in Germany came forward with a story. Her mother had worked in intelligence. She had travelled frequently. She had used different names. She had died years earlier. When the daughter saw the Isdal Woman's photograph, she felt something click. The story made headlines. Interviews were done. DNA tests were arranged. They did not match. This is, in many ways, the pattern of this entire case. A flare of light, a surge of hope, and then the quiet, return to uncertainty. What the digital age has done, more than anything else, is turn the Isdal Woman into a shared project. She no longer belongs to a single police department or a single country. She belongs to anyone who is willing to sit with her story and turn it over in their mind. There is something strangely intimate about that. thousands of people scattered across the world, all thinking about the same unknown woman, all imagining her in hotel rooms, on trains, standing at windows, writing in notebooks. In a way, she has become more present in death than she ever was in life. And that brings us to one of the smallest details in the case, one that often gets lost in the larger theories. In one of the hotels, she left behind a pair of earrings. Not expensive, not particularly distinctive, just a small, ordinary pair of earrings sitting in a drawer. It is such a human mistake, the kind of thing anyone could do, the kind of thing that suggests distraction or fatigue or simply being in a hurry. It does not fit neatly with the image of a hyper-careful operative who plans every move. It fits better with the image of a person who is, at the end of the day, just a person. I find myself returning to that image often. A woman standing in a hotel room, looking around, deciding what to take and what to leave. Maybe she noticed the earrings and decided they did not matter. Maybe she did not notice them at all. Either way, they are still there, in a police evidence box somewhere. A small, quiet reminder that for all the mystery, there are moments in this story that are painfully ordinary. At some point, every investigation reaches a moment where the evidence stops giving and starts repeating itself. The same facts, the same photographs, the same witness statements, arranged in slightly different orders, hoping to unlock a door that no longer seems to exist. This is where the Isdal Woman now lives, in that quiet, circular space where certainty is always just one detail away and never quite arrives. The official conclusion remains what it has been for decades. Suicide. A troubled woman living under false identities, choosing a remote valley to end her life in a dramatic and final way. The report is careful, measured, and unsatisfying in a way that only official documents can be. It accounts for the sleeping pills. It accounts for the gasoline. It accounts for the lack of immediate signs of a struggle. It does not account for much else. Because even if you accept that she chose to die, you are still left with the life she lived beforehand. The planning, the movement, the layers of identity, the careful erasure of her past. Suicide explains an ending. It does not explain a method of living that looks, from the outside, like a long, deliberate performance. There is a tendency, when faced with a story like this, to search for a single, elegant answer, a revelation that ties everything together, a name that suddenly makes sense of the codes, the travel, the behaviour. But real life is rarely that tidy. More often, it leaves you with overlapping truths that refuse to settle into a single shape. The Isdal Woman may have been involved in intelligence work. She may have been moving through the margins of Cold War Europe, carrying information that mattered to people who did not want their names in print. She may also have been nothing of the sort. She may have been a woman who learned, through experience, that anonymity could be a kind of safety, and who carried that lesson with her from country to country. She may have been both. What lingers, more than any theory, is the image of her moving through ordinary spaces while carrying something entirely private inside her, sitting in hotel dining rooms, watching people who knew exactly who they were, riding trains with a suitcase full of clothes that did not belong to any single version of herself, writing in a notebook that looked like a code to everyone else, but may have simply been a way of keeping track of a life that refused to stay still. There is a quiet tragedy in that, regardless of how you interpret the ending. A life that leaves so little behind is a life that does not get to be remembered in the way most of us are. No stories told by friends. No photographs passed around at family gatherings. No small, embarrassing memories that humanize a person long after they are gone. Instead, she is remembered as a mystery, a silhouette, a face reconstructed by software and imagination. And yet, in another sense, she is remembered more widely than most people ever will be. Her story has crossed borders. It has outlived the political world that may or may not have shaped it. It has found its way into late-night conversations, classrooms, podcasts, and quiet moments when someone stumbles across her name and decides, for whatever reason, to stay with it for a while. There is something almost poetic in that. A woman who spent her life trying not to be known becomes known everywhere, but never quite understood. Sometimes I imagine her in one of those hotel rooms, sitting on the edge of the bed, listening to the sounds of a city she will leave in the morning. Cars passing, voices in a language she may or may not claim as her own. The quiet comfort of knowing that no one in that building truly knows who she is, or where she has been, or where she's going next. Maybe that was freedom to her, or maybe it was loneliness, or maybe, like most things, it was a complicated mixture of both. The valley where she was found is still there. People still walk through it. Children still point at rocks and trees and notice things adults have learned to ignore. The landscape has absorbed the story in the way landscapes always do, without comment, without judgment. Somewhere, in an archive, there is a box with her belongings, the wigs, the glasses, the notebook, the earrings. Objects that once belonged to a person who made choices, felt fear, felt confidence, felt something strong enough to shape the path she took across a continent. And somewhere, perhaps, there is still a name that fits her, a birth certificate, a school record, a memory in someone's mind of a woman who left and never quite explained why. Until that name surfaces, if it ever does, the Isdal Woman remains suspended in that space between fact and story. A presence rather than a person, a question rather than an answer. And maybe that is why she continues to draw people in, not because we expect to solve her, but because in trying to understand her, we are really circling something much closer to ourselves. The idea that any life, no matter how carefully documented, can still hold a private core that no one else ever fully reaches. She walked into a valley called Ice Valley, carrying what she needed for whatever she believed would happen next. The world found her there, but it did not find her story. Not completely, and so it keeps looking